Good day. I'd originally intended to devote some of this video to a discussion later of the state of the Russian economy in light of certain questions I've received from a number of people about the Russian budget situation. A non-issue, in my opinion. But as events have turned out, it's the problems of a completely different economy, that of the United States, that I'm going to have to discuss instead. But before I do that, I think it's proper and right that I should first address the situation in Ukraine, very much the epicenter of the crisis, and by the way, one which, to some extent at least, provides some explanation for the economic problems in the United States. And I don't just mean the specific problems we have now, but the kind of general problems that have been accumulating in the United States for a very long time. Not just Ukraine, obviously, but the whole direction of US foreign policy. I'm going to, as I said, initially focus anyway on the situation in Ukraine before I come to these American economic issues. So where are we? Now, over the last couple of days, I have been discussing the situation in Bakhmut, the situation in the battle lines across Ukraine, and of course, we still have a lot of news coming out of Bakhmut. And it's an interesting situation in Bakhmut because, to put it mildly, because of course we've had lots of discussion over the last couple of days about a possible Ukrainian counterattack in Bakhmut to break through the cauldron that the Russians claim they have established there. Now, on that topic of a cauldron in Bakhmut, there's been some really rather strong denials that such a cauldron even exists, but a Ukrainian commentator, a commander of a Ukrainian military unit, actually discussed at least the looming cauldron in Bakhmut. He doesn't yet admit that there is one. And his name is Denis Yaroslavsky, and he discussed this in an interview that he gave yesterday with Espresso TV. And he's quoted as saying this: "Fighting is going on right now in the streets of in Bakhmut. The biggest threat is that the neck of the so-called pocket is not more than 4 kilometers. There is nothing without logistics, neither rotation nor supplies of munitions." And Yaroslavsky then went on to make a direct comparison between the situation in Bakhmut and that in Debaltseve in 2015. We understand that it may be Debaltseve's repetition, a similar situation where roads are blocked and the withdrawal of troops may be a threat to the entire column. It is very dangerous because of this 4-kilometer neck. And I should say that there's also been other commentaries. This is from Strana, a rather good Ukrainian media outlet, one I should say that the Ukrainian government strongly disapproves of. I believe it now operates from outside Ukraine. But it has talked about the critical situation in Debaltseve. Bear in mind, as I said, that this is an anti-government media outlet. And it says that as soon as the Russians take control of the road to Khromovo, Bakhmut will begin to gradually turn from a fortress to a big communal grave. Then it will make no sense to stay tight-lipped about things that have been irritating for months. Maybe someone will see treason in them, but I wouldn't give a hoot about that. Patience is running out. and that's what Strana said, and it claims that this comment came from a soldier of the Ukrainian Army's 93rd Brigade, and that this comment appeared on the Telegram channel of that particular brigade. Now, to be very clear, these people are not yet talking about an existing cauldron. The Russians are. But they're coming very close to acknowledging that such a cauldron either already does exist in Bakhmut or is imminently threatened. Notice that Yaroslavsky talked about the situation in Bakhmut as a pocket. He said that the funnel is only 4 kilometers long. He admitted that, or appeared to admit, that the roads are in effect blocked. And he talked about a very dangerous situation for the Ukrainian troops there. And this soldier that Strana says that they have taken these quotations from is basically hanging the entire future of the Ukrainian troops in Bakhmut upon control of this road that passes through Khromovo, and he seems to acknowledge that if this road is captured by the Russians, and bear in mind yesterday I discussed that there were reports that the Russians have actually cut this road. I'm not sure whether they're true, but there were those reports, and it's been widely acknowledged for some time that the Russians are able to shell and launch anti-tank missiles on any vehicles that try to pass up and down this road. Well, this soldier, quoted by Strana, is now talking about a graveyard, a big communal grave in Bakhmut, if that road is finally and conclusively severed. So, yes, I do think that we are in effect in a cauldron, though it is only a developing one. The Russians haven't fully secured it. There are still access points, but can I just say that cauldrons are not like medieval sieges. I've said this many times. The point is, already we see that even in the present conditions, it's probably all but impossible for Ukrainian forces to conduct an organized withdrawal from Bakhmut. They might be able to escape in small groups across these muddy fields, but an organized withdrawal will be extremely difficult unless Ukraine finds some way of reopening these two roads. And in light of that, there's been some rather concerning news for Ukraine today, and that is that there's now word, and I can't confirm this again, but it seems plausible, that the Ukrainian attempt to break through this developing cauldron in Bakhmut, in other words, this attempt to reopen the roads, has had to be postponed by a week because of the deteriorating weather conditions. Now, there's references to General Syrskyi, the ground force commander. He's apparently again visited the front lines. He's been talking to the commanders. Apparently he's made a decision that the situation, the ground is now so muddy that wheeled vehicles simply can't operate in this kind of very soft ground. Ukraine clearly doesn't have enough tracked vehicles, or if it does have tracked vehicles, they're tracked vehicles of the wrong kind, with tracks that are too narrow to operate in these conditions. And he's had to call the breakthrough attempt, the attempt to break this cauldron, he's had to postpone it for a week. And of course, in the kind of situation that we see in Bakhmut, if this is true, if This is indeed what Syrskyi has accepted and agreed to do. And this isn't just a ruse to throw the Russians off their guard, which is possible, but I think is unlikely. If this is true, then of course in a week's time, the Russians will have had more time to prepare for any Ukrainian counterattack. They'll have had more time to thicken out and solidify the cauldron, and that apparently is what they're doing. Now, there's been a cascade of reports about this whole situation now in the Western media. There's been reports in the Wall Street Journal about how Ukraine is suffering enormous losses in Bakhmut, about how the difficult weather conditions and the fact that wounded people have to be evacuated from Bakhmut across these muddy fields is escalating, is increasing Ukrainian losses. There's been a report in the London Times about how Ukraine is suffering losses in this fighting in Bakhmut on a scale unknown to any NATO army, to any NATO military. We've had an extraordinary and very interesting article in Politico, which essentially highlights the divisions that are now growing between the United States government and Ukraine, criticizes Ukraine for all sorts of things. It criticizes Ukraine's leaders, President Zelensky in particular, in ways that I've never seen any US media outlet do up till now. It says that the United States has become increasingly dubious about some of Ukraine's actions, that this article essentially attributes the Nord Stream attack to Ukraine, which is very interesting, by the way, and does so in a way that implies that the US government does think that the Ukrainian government was involved. I'm going to come back to that shortly. But in relation to the problems in Bakhmut, it specifically appears to blame Ukraine for the operational crisis in Bakhmut. It says that the Ukrainians disregarded US advice, which is that Bakhmut was not worth fighting for, and the result is that Ukraine has now got itself in Bakhmut in the mess in which it is in. The article, by the way, also says that the United States is becoming increasingly irritated by Ukraine's unending demands for more and more weapons, and Ukraine's lack of appreciation and gratitude for the number of weapons that it has already been provided by the United States, implying that there is now actual personal tensions between Ukrainian leaders and some senior officials in the United States government. Anyway, whether or not the United States has indeed been urging Ukraine to pull back from Bakhmut, and I have to say on this issue, I tend to agree with my colleague Alex Christoforou that probably Ukraine has been getting conflicting advice from the different factions within the US government. I'm going to pass over that. I'm not going to discuss that in detail now. The fact remains that according to Syrskyi at least, and of course Zelensky as well, Bakhmut remains of overriding importance. Ukraine has no option but to defend it. Its fall would lead to the disintegration, the gradual, slow motion disintegration of Ukrainian defences in Donbass, and the result is that Ukraine is continuing to rush reinforcements to support this presumed eventual counterattack in Bakhmut, and to try, to the extent that is still possible, to reinforce the garrison there. And there's now more and more reports that Ukraine is now pulling in all its reserves from every possible direction to try to do this. So there's reports that Ukraine is now stripping the Belarus border bare of troops. Ukraine had, a few weeks ago, deployed significant numbers of troops to the Belarus border, worried about this Russian build-up in Belarus. Apparently they've decided that whatever threat that Russian force in Belarus poses, it's no longer so urgent that those Ukrainian troops should continue to be kept there. They're being rushed to Bakhmut instead. So the Belarus border, and my sense is not just the Belarus border, but the northern borders of Ukraine are being stripped of their troops in order to protect Bakhmut. More remarkably, it seems that Ukraine is also pulling troops away from the Kremenaya, Svatovo, Kupiansk, Liman region. Now, this is really very extraordinary because there was a rather desperate article, or at least parts of the article read to me as fairly desperate, in the London Times about the situation there. And there were comments from Ukrainian soldiers describing a situation which, in some respects, bears some similarity to the situation in Bakhmut. And there were reports from within this article that it is in fact in the Kremenaya Svatovo area that the biggest military build-up by the Russian forces since the mobilization in September is taking place, and that the Ukrainian forces in this area are coming under increasing pressure and feel themselves heavily outnumbered. And there was even a rather sad comment by a Ukrainian soldier that Ukraine couldn't hope to compete with Russia, at least in this sector of the battlefield, in terms of tanks, because the Russians supposedly are building 30 tanks a day, 30 new tanks a day. Now, as to that, I have already discussed Russian tank production figures. I think that the figure of 20 tanks a month built by Uralvagonzavod and perhaps another 800 tanks being renovated in the two tank factories in Russia, Uralvagonzavod in the Urals and Omsk, also in that part of the world, by the way. I think these figures are probably pre-war, and I suspect that real production numbers of Russian tanks are now significantly higher, but I don't think the Russians are making tanks at the rate of 30 a day. I think that's too much by orders of magnitude. But what that comment does perhaps reflect is the extreme pressure that Ukrainian troops in this part of the battlefront now feel themselves under. They talk also, by the way, about how forest fighting seems to be becoming much more difficult for them than it was. Ukraine seemed to have a consistent advantage in forest fighting earlier in the war. I have to say that I've seen some explanations for this from various commentators, such as Big Serge. They seem to think that the reason Ukraine was able to succeed in the forests in the first half of 2022 was because of a general lack of infantry in the Russian formations that entered Ukraine in the first half of 2022. The Russians now having a lot more infantry, they're able to make serious advances in the forests, and of course they've got many more drones, many more machines to keep track of what the Ukrainians are doing there. So you see lots and lots of pressure in multiple areas of the front lines. And this doesn't even take into account the other looming operational crisis that Ukraine is facing in the Avdiivka area, which I discussed extensively yesterday. And by the way, I saw a report, I think it was from a Russian channel, which effectively admitted that it is the aerial bombing of Ukrainian fortifications in Avdiivka and in the surrounding areas, which explains the rapid Russian advances in this area, which have taken place over the last few weeks. Anyway, there was these increasingly grim commentaries about the Ukrainian situation. Don't even, as I said, look at the situation in Avdiivka or the situation in Vuhledar and Marinka, where apparently the Russians are now once again pushing forward and maybe intending to break Ukrainian resistance in these places as well. But let's get back to Bakhmut, because even as the Ukrainians claim, or reports say, that their counterattack in Bakhmut has been postponed for a week, we're getting more reports about what the Russians are doing. And there's a report today that Russian forces from the Wagner Group are advancing along the Artyomovsk Slaviansk highway. There's now heavy fighting in two villages, Golubovka and Minkova, which are, by the way, 20 kilometers northwest of Artyomovsk, Bakhmut, according to the Russians. And there's also other reports that the Russians are pressing forward with their attack on the village that I discussed yesterday, Orekhovo, Ivanova, I believe it was, northwest of Bakhmut, even though that village continues to be under Ukrainian control. And the whole situation is looking grim for Ukraine. And there's been, as I said, lots of comments about how bleak, as I said, the situation in Bakhmut is becoming. There's also been, by the way, lots of information about fighting within Bakhmut itself. And the Daily Telegraph has now, in effect, admitted significant Russian advances within the Azom plant inside Bakhmut, this big factory that is located inside Bakhmut. Apparently, Russian troops, again, I should say clearly, Wagner assault troops, they appear to be operating not just on the surface, gradually clearing this plant of this factory, this big factory, of its defenders. They also seem to be have entered the sort of various underground passages and facilities beneath this plant, and there is rather grisly news of fighting going on underground with the Wagner troops apparently smoking out or pushing out or tracking down the Ukrainian defenders, such Ukrainian defenders as there are there. I'm going to say straight away that it seems to me that there were been various comparisons between Ukrainian defences in this plant with what happened at the Azovstal steelworks in Mariupol. I get the sense that the Ukrainian troops in Bakhmut are nowhere near as organised or as prepared or as motivated as the Azov fighters who found themselves beneath the Azovstal steelworks. And I think that this has to some extent changed the dynamic of the battlefield there. Now, I would say also the fact that the Russian forces are pushing north towards Slaviansk suggests to me that the Russians are not just working to harden their defenses around Bakhmut in anticipation of any Ukrainian counterattack to try to relieve the pressure on the garrison in Bakhmut. It reinforces my view that the Russians might actually be considering a bigger encirclement. And as I've said, for many weeks, there were long been large numbers of Ukrainian formations located in and around Bakhmut. Given that there are said to be 190 Russian battalions lurking nearby in the vicinity, not actually so far engaged in the fighting, it does seem to me that from a Russian point of view, the possibilities of a bigger envelopment of the Ukrainian forces in the event that some kind of a counterattack is attempted, anyway, that possibility must be attractive. And it could be, or so I think in my completely inexpert view, or so it could be, and it could be that these advances towards the north are to some extent preparing the ground for a bigger envelopment operation of that kind. Anyway, grim news, in other words, for Ukraine on the battlefields. Grim news in particular in Bakhmut. Growing doubts about the direction of the war, both in the Western media, according to Politico, apparently on the part of certain officials of the US government, and from multiple sources, from various reporters, from various soldiers on the ground. And in fact, I've just seen a report from a tweet from somebody called Neil Hauer, presumably a journalist. He says that met up this afternoon with some soldiers just back from Bakhmut after 5 months there and Severodonetsk last summer to say they were not positive about Ukrainian command is an understatement. So one could sense that things are going very badly wrong for Ukraine on the battlefields. Before I finish with the battlefield news, I should say that the rumours about some kind of hypersonic missile strike on some sort of important command bunker are now growing, and I haven't seen any denials. Perhaps it is true, and there are some reports that the destruction of this bunker, if it happened, and the death of possibly hundreds of senior officers and technicians has dealt a devastating blow to the coordination of Ukraine's air defense system. And this may explain, by the way, why there's been some attempts by American officials to downplay the effectiveness of the Patriot anti-aircraft system that is in the process of being supplied to Ukraine. I was somewhat puzzled by some of these claims, but there's now more reports that US officials are saying that the Patriot is not really effective against certain types of cruise missiles, including certain types of subsonic cruise missiles, and that it's not really effective against drones either. Apparently it's more effective against ballistic missiles, and I presume manned aircraft, since most of the problems Ukraine has been experiencing over the last couple of months, since October, have come from cruise missiles, some of them subsonic, and from drones. That really does beg the question of why, in that case, was Ukraine supplied with Patriot systems in the first place. But anyway, I'm not going to say much more about that because this information is so sketchy and vague and so completely uncorroborated that, to be frank, about this command bunker, to be frank, I'm still not entirely convinced that it's true. So, a very, very bad situation in Ukraine, and all of this coming on top of further important diplomatic initiatives being taken, if you like, by the other side. It's now confirmed that Xi Jinping is definitely heading for Moscow. There's some reports that he's going to be there next week. Well, we'll just have to see. In the meantime, President Lukashenko of Belarus is in Iran, where he is meeting the Iranian government. And we see that Iran has played an active role in supporting the Russian military operation in Ukraine. It supplied drones, or at the very least drone technology, to the Russians. I'm sure it is actually drones, in fact. And it could be that some kind of further cooperation or collaboration between the Belarusians and the Iranians is now under discussion. And I wonder whether Belarus might become the place where construction of certain types of Iranian drones now begins to take place. Belarus has a very highly developed industrial base, by the way, just saying. But perhaps the most interesting development of all, in, as I say, coming from the Russian side, is from Dmitry Peskov, who is Putin's spokesman. And I'm going to read what Peskov has said, and undoubtedly he's doing so with the authority of Putin himself. He is Putin's spokesman, after all. And this is what TASS reports, how TASS reports Peskov's words. Russia's goals in Ukraine can only be achieved by military means at the moment, Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov told reporters on Monday. To us, the absolute priority continues and will always remain the achievement of the goals set. At the moment, they can only be achieved by military means. The Kremlin does not yet see any preconditions for the transition of the situation in Ukraine to a peaceful course. So far, there are no preconditions for the transition of the process into a peaceful course, Peskov said. Now, this was all said in response to certain comments by the chairman of the Munich Security Conference, Wolfgang Ischinger, who is, of course, a German official, or former German official, and he is the person who, as I said, chairs the Munich Security Conference. I've discussed that, the Munich Security Conference, many times. Anyway, Ischinger, in an article that recently appeared in Der Tagesspiegel newspaper, said that the Western powers need to start thinking seriously about a peace process for Ukraine, an interesting fact in itself, and he suggested the setting up of a Western contact group, and he seemed to see this contact group as effecting some kind of mediation arrangements between Ukraine and Russia. And Ischinger spoke about this contact group, including Britain, Germany, the United States, and France. He also suggested that the United States and the EU and the OSCE, NATO and a number of other countries, Spain, Canada, Poland and the Baltic states might also participate. And Peskov said, nothing doing. He said, if this group is ever formed, the Russians will have nothing to do with it. And the idea that the Russians would accept a group of this kind as some kind of mediators in the conflict between themselves and Ukraine, well, that is obviously a nonsensical idea, given that they have all been such fervid supporters of Ukraine, and basically Peskov killed the whole proposal stone dead. What Peskov did say, though, and this is the key point in his comments, is that for the moment the Russians feel that the situation in Ukraine is such that a military solution is the only viable one, and that is what for the moment the Russians are pursuing. Peskov didn't completely slam the door on talks, but he suggested that at the moment the conditions for talks between Russia and Ukraine do not exist. And when he makes the further observation that for us the absolute priority continues and will always remain the achievement of the goals set, Peskov in effect says that the only basis upon which negotiations can happen are those set out by Putin in the speeches that he made in February 2022, when he announced the initiation of the special military operation, and that means independence for Donbass, neutral status for Ukraine outside NATO, and the denazification and demilitarization of Ukraine. Those are in effect Peskov's words. So what Peskov is essentially saying is that the only basis upon which Russia is prepared to talk with Ukraine is a basis upon which Ukraine agrees to Russia's original conditions. The Ukrainians would, of course, see that as a capitulation, and for the moment it's clear they're not ready for that. So in the meantime, the fighting goes on. Anyway, that's where we are in the fighting in Ukraine. Russians continuing to make progress, coming very close now, or so it seems to me. If they control the Azov factory to the position where they're able to dominate Bakhmut, if they capture this factory within the next couple of days, then it may be too late for any Ukrainian counterattack that is planned in this area, assuming that such a counterattack even takes place. And of course, I'm not even discussing now its prospects of success in the face of the forces that are the Russian forces that appear to be gathered in this area. And of course, over and above and beyond that, we see the Russians continuing advances, not just in Bakhmut and in the immediate surrounding areas, but pushing northward, perhaps aiming for some bigger envelopment which might come. So, a very dark picture for Ukraine. Well, what has all this got to do with the fact that in the United States 2 banks have failed? Well, I would say quite a lot, actually. But in order to understand why, I think I should make clear, first of all, that I think that many, or in fact most, of the US's economic problems, what underlines US economic problems, is its massively over-ambitious foreign policy. And I think that this is a problem that has been gathering steam now for many decades, at least from the 1960s, and it's this ultimately that I think I would like to discuss. Now, my starting point is going to be an article by the outstanding economic commentator Eve Smith on naked capitalism, in which she made a point that one of her teachers at Harvard, who was a member of the Cabot Lodge dynasty, so one of the famous New England dynasties, and a lot of them were very prominent diplomats. Anyway, a teacher there told her, she was being told the class during a lecture, presumably, that it was in 1968 that he realized that the United States faced limits on its power, that it could not conduct a war in Asia, a ground war in Asia, in other words, Vietnam, abolish poverty in the United States, in other words, Lyndon Johnson's Great Society program, and place a man in the moon, all at the same time, without overstraining its economic strength. To that list, by the way, I would also add competing in the new nuclear arms race with the Soviets, which in the late 1960s started to crank up to dizzying dimensions as the Soviets began to build an ever greater number of intercontinental ballistic missiles and launch bewildering numbers of nuclear submarines, ballistic missile submarines, and began to develop anti-ballistic missile systems. And I think this has been the fundamental problem all along. You go back to the 1960s. What basically happened in the 1960s was that the US government of that time, the administration of Lyndon Johnson, trying to reconcile all of these conflicting demands, together with the Fed, it basically allowed very, very high spending in the United States. That high spending was covered by borrowing. The Fed, to some extent, proved accommodating by keeping interest rates lower than they had been. The need by US industry at that time, and we're talking about a time when the United States had by far the world's biggest industrial base, the need to fulfill all the various competing orders for military equipment for Vietnam, for weapon systems to compete with the Soviets in the nuclear arms race. All of that started to place growing stress on US industry. US factories and US production were increasingly diverted from providing civilian products, consumer goods, for the civilian economy to military production. That meant that imports into the United States started to rise and inflation pressures started to grow. And that began to cause increasing concern, especially in Europe, about the ability of the United States, which at that time was still locked in the Bretton Woods system of fixed exchange rates, to cover its deficits. And European leaders, specifically and most importantly the French, at that time the government was the one led by General de Gaulle, which was far from sympathetic to American objectives in Vietnam, and which was critical of the United States altogether. Anyway, the French government, but also other European governments, accordingly started to have increasing doubts about the stability of the dollar, the stability of the US's commitment to paying its debts, and they started to insist on payment in gold in place of dollars as the US deficits grew. And this problem intensified, and US gold reserves started to fall. They'd already been falling throughout the 50s and 60s as the United States competed with the Soviets in the Cold War and during the nuclear arms race, but they began to fall rapidly. And famously in 1971, Richard Nixon, the then president in succession to Lyndon Johnson, took the decision to sever the link from gold and to float the dollar freely on international money markets. Now, this event, the effective default of 1971, which is what it was, though it didn't actually receive a huge amount of publicity at the time, this event was, as we see, a product of US foreign policy. US foreign policy had become overextended. They were trying to do in the 60s far too much. They were trying to wage war in Vietnam, taking on both the Soviets and the Chinese, who were supplying weapons to the North Vietnamese. They were trying to compete with the Soviets in nuclear weapons. They were engaged in the Great Society program to deliver on the promises that the Kennedy and Johnson administrations had made to, in effect, complete Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal. And, of course, they also had the big expense of the moon program. So, all of which, to be very clear, also had a significant foreign policy aspect. So all of these competing demands became too much, and they had to sever the link to the dollar. And what eventually replaced it, because the United States in those days still had lots of friends, was a situation where the dollar again became a reserve currency, but it became a reserve currency this time backed not by gold, but in effect by oil, as agreed by the US and the Saudis in that famous deal that took place in the 1970s, oil being the world's most widely traded commodity. So everybody therefore had to have dollars in order to buy oil, oil being essential for US industries, for world industries rather. You couldn't run industries or a modern economy without oil, and that provided in effect a backstop to the dollar. And there was a period of very great turbulence. There was the big monetary overhang from the 60s, which caused high inflation in the United States and globally in the 1970s. But by the 1980s, the situation appeared to some extent to have stabilized, and we saw inflation rates begin to fall, and basically a new system, perhaps less stable than the old one, but still possessing of a certain stability, began to establish itself. But this new system ran into the same problems as the previous system did, which is, again, US ambitions knew no limit, and with a reserve currency, possessed now of a reserve currency backed by oil, the United States again tried to do more than perhaps it realistically could. And we've had, since then, a situation where this financial system has become overstretched and where the United States has increasingly tried to meet all of its various financial obligations by flooding the world with liquidity, by in effect producing dollars. Now, it could not do that to anything like the same extent before, in the 50s and 60s, because of the constraints of the Bretton Woods system, which, as I said, collapsed as a result in the early 70s. But what it found with this new system that had established itself in the 70s and which achieved its stability in the 1980s, what the US found is that this new system could be stretched much further than the old system could. And the US was also fortunate in the late 80s and early 90s that two events took place which meant that the system could be stretched further still. In 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed, removing from the scene the US's biggest geopolitical competitor, which meant that the US was no longer locked in a permanent nuclear arms race with the Soviets. And it also made the Soviet Union's enormous fund of natural resources, and by the way also some of its technologies, available, and these provided a big lift to the economy generally. And the other, of course, was the rise of China as the world's factory, which meant that goods could be imported from China very cheaply and supplied to the US domestic market, paid for in this seemingly unlimited quantity of dollars, and that meant that inflationary pressures in the United States, with this combination of increased natural resources from the Russians, cheap goods from China, inflationary pressures remained subdued. And that in turn also meant that with inflationary pressures reduced, the temptation to increase liquidity continued. And with every bump in the road, especially after the 1987 stock market crash, with every bump in the road, the United States responded to further increases in liquidity, to production of more and more dollars. And I'm going to suggest that this is what is ultimately the problem, because what has happened is that since the late 1990s, we started to see a financial system in the United States that has become very overextended and very over-complex, and which has become less geared to supporting the US domestic economy and more ultimately to making US foreign policy objectives attainable. So, as I said, the United States simply produces dollars whenever it has to in order to conduct its various global operations, to maintain its huge military forces. And it does this partly by borrowing at very low rates, because the Federal Reserve Board, basically since the 1987 crisis, has kept interest rates very, very low, except for short intervals. And of course also, since the 2008 financial crisis, by quantitative easing, a form of money printing which many people deny is actually money printing. So the result of this overextended financial system, unmoored increasingly to the needs of the domestic economy, is of a financial system that is becoming increasingly prone to problems. And we've had a whole succession of problems, as I said, starting to appear since the late 1990s. The first one in the series was the crisis in 1997 involving the hedge fund long-term capital management. Then there was the Asian financial crisis of 1998. Then there was the dot-com crisis of the early 2000s. Then there was the much bigger crisis in the US and to some extent British mortgage markets, which escalated into the 2008 crisis. That was less a tremor, more like an earthquake. And there have been more problems ever since. And as I said, always the problem has been to increase liquidity. And of course, liquidity means that the system has become over-dependent on very low interest rates. And instead of capital in the United States being created through what might be considered conventional economic activity, manufacturing, trade in goods, that sort of thing, we've had a situation which has slowly evolved in which capital is created through this very strange process, at the heart of which are the actions of the United States' own central bank, the Federal Reserve Board. And what we now have is what could be another tremor. We've had the failure of two banks. The one that's attracted the most attention is SVB, this bank that was so heavily connected with the internet, with the tech industries in Silicon Valley. Now, is this just a tremor, or is this the sign of another systemic crisis, an earthquake, if you like, in the financial system, comparable to the one we saw in 2008? I don't think anybody knows, and I don't pretend that I do. You'll find all kinds of people out there who claim that they do know, but I don't think any of them actually does. I saw a rather complacent article in the Financial Times, for example, saying that SVB is completely different from other banks. Most of the banks around the world in the United States are solid and solvent, and we needn't worry. I remember exactly the same thing being said in the months leading up to the 2008 crisis. It was all that was happening was a temporary credit crunch, supposedly. It was only in the autumn of 2008 that it all came together, and it became clear that it was something far, far worse. On the other hand, you also get other people who coming forward and saying this is the harbinger of the end, the entire system is about to collapse. I don't know. I am not in a position to say one way or the other, and I don't think, as I said, anybody does. What I will say is the one thing that strikes me about SVB, which is different, is that, as far as I can tell, many of its problems come from the fact that it overinvested in US Treasury bonds. Now, not so long ago, US Treasury bonds, that's to say the bonds issued by the US government, the US Treasury, in order to fund the US deficits, US Treasury bonds were considered just about the safest investment you could own. Now, and they were in fact so safe that, as I remember, they were traded almost with the same ease as money was. I mean, you could actually sell treasury bonds and raise funds without almost any problems at all. Now, it seems the problem is that with interest rates in the United States rising over the last year or so, the value of treasury bonds has fallen. Fewer people want to hold treasury bonds for some reason. There's some doubts perhaps about the financial credibility of the US government. Anyway, one way or the other, it seems that treasury bonds at the moment are not such good things to hold. I'm not sure that I entirely understand this, maybe getting this radically wrong, but anyway, it does seem, according to some of the commentaries I've been reading in the Financial Times and other places, that SVB's mistake was to overinvest in treasury bonds, and especially as these are supposedly long-term instruments, that left it short in terms of its own short-term problems. But ultimately, I come back to what I was saying, these problems, or so it seems to me, come down in the end to an wildly overambitious foreign policy, which has been conducted by the United States at least since the 1960s. If you set yourself no limit on what you want to do, this going back to Eve Smith's quote of those words by Cabot Lodge. If you set yourself no limits, you need unlimited resources and you need unlimited money. And since in the real world there always are limits, if you do that, you will overextend your financial system and you will devalue your own money. It is inevitable. And Ukraine is just a further example of this. We can see this happening now in the way that the whole thing has played out. The United States finds that it no longer has the means, the industrial means, to keep Ukraine supplied with all the weapon systems it needs. That's ultimately that complaint in that article in Politico that I was talking about. It can't supply Ukraine with all the ammunition it needs. Its tanks are unsuitable. Its fighter jets are unsuitable. It's got all of those multiple problems of depleting arsenals that's been discussed with such extreme clarity by Brian Beletic at the New Atlas, who's been covering this topic for many, many months. And of course, that problem arises because the financial system is not supporting the industrial base, and the US has come to think of its problems in pure dollar terms. It looks at its solution to all its problems is to throw money at the problems, which means at the end of the day, creating more money to throw at those problems, rather than looking at the underlying problems of the economy and of the industrial base. This is, as I say, what comes if you unmoor the financial system from the actual economy upon which it is supposed to serve. And inevitably, when this happens, you're going to see problems like the ones we just see. And of course, if you add to those problems of your financial system further problems, if you're going to engage in an economic war with an adversary which is self-sufficient, both in resources and in industrial terms, and which has a financial system far more conventionally organized than your own, then you're going to make your problems worse, especially if that adversary, Russia in this case, plays a central role in the global economy because it is such a key commodities producer. You will see inflation rise, you will see shortages of goods grow, you will have problems with energy, and you're going to have to find ways to reconcile all these problems and try to contain your inflationary pressures by increasing interest rates, which undercuts and weakens this very same financial system that you've created and which has all of those problems. The United States is not going to be able to end these recurring problems, which, as I said, might very well turn catastrophic and systemic, might lead to the kind of implosion that some people are talking about, unless and until it starts to conduct a much more realistic foreign policy, one much more grounded in its actual resources and based on its real needs. A realistic financial policy, a realistic monetary policy depend in the end on a realistic foreign policy. If your foreign policy remains as disconnected from reality as the current US foreign policy is, then all the tinkering that you do in the meantime, all the adjustments, all the rearrangements, the resort to things like QE, the playing with interest rates, the repo auctions, whatever it is that you're trying to do to get yourself through your various problems, all of that is going to have no ultimate effect at best. It can only kick the can a little further down the road. So I'm afraid this is a very general overview of the problems. As I said, let me repeat again. If you're asking me, is the collapse of SVB and the other bank, is it the beginning of the end? Is it, the great crisis that lots of people, Peter Schiff, Mitch Feinstein, lots of others have been predicting? Well, as I said, I don't know. But it is another big tremor in a system that is clearly in deep trouble. And as I said, unless foreign policy is brought under control and becomes realistic and is cut back to reflect the US's actual resources and its actual interests, these problems in the financial system and the economy will continue and will continue to aggravate. Well, rather theoretical topic today. I'll be interested to see what people think and whether they agree with my views on this. But in the meantime, this is where I end this program today. Tomorrow, we'll be turning to the Russian economy, a very different economy, and I'll be discussing some of its problems and some of its strengths, and I'll be answering some of the questions that I've been getting from all sorts of people about its budget situation and about its overall fiscal position. So that's Russia tomorrow, the US today. We'll see, as I said, how things turn out in the US. I'd say, by the way, this is a difficult economy, the US economy, to predict what's going to happen to it in the short term. Because, as I said, policy there has been so unorthodox for such a long time that it's very difficult to make much sense at any particular point in time of what is actually going on. Some people may think they know, but I very much doubt that they actually do. With Russia, as we'll see tomorrow, things are much more simple. Anyway, that's me for today. More from me soon. Let me repeat again, I will obviously be keeping track of all the events in Ukraine, in Bakhmut, in Kupiansk, Kremlin, all of those places. We'll be seeing, as I said, whether the stresses between the Ukrainians and the Western powers overflow. We'll see whether there's really is going to be a counterattack by Ukraine next week, or whether they try and bring it forward, or whether they cancel it entirely, and what the Wagner group and the Russians do in the meantime. But in the meantime, as I said, this video ends, and it only remains for me to thank you for joining me again, and to remind you that you can find all our videos on our various platforms: Locals, Rumble, BitChute, ODYSEE, Rockfin, and Telegram. You can also support our work, if you so choose, via Patreon and Subscribestar. Links under this video. You can also go to our shop and buy the great things that you will find there: our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, and all those great things. And last but not least, please remember, if you've liked this video, to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you for joining me again today, and more from me soon.